Hello, everybody. You're listening to Chris Hattingh, researcher at the Free Market Foundation. Thank you for joining me today on my latest solo podcast. I apologize if you can't hear me there clearly the whole time. I'm suffering from man flu, and to all the guys out there, you know how debilitating and difficult the situation can be when you have man flu, but I'm here soldiering on, and I hope that you enjoy the discussion that we have today. Today I thought I'd talk about an article by Imraam Buccus, which appeared in the Sunday Times this past weekend. The title of the article is "A Bad Day at the Polls for the Left as Numsa Stumbles." Now, with an article like this, which is sort of a political analysis of the latest elections we've had in South Africa, it helps when the author unpacks the terms that they use, that they provide definitions for certain terms, which the author here unfortunately doesn't do. So I'm going to provide my interpretation of certain things and sort of a philosophical unpacking of what I think is going on in the article. Now, in general, the author is saying that the left, as he understands it, has suffered in this election. There's no viable left in South Africa, which I fundamentally disagree with. I see the ANC and the EFF as very much on the left of the political and philosophical spectrums, but we'll get into the article in some more detail. He starts off by pointing out that the crude racial populism of the EFF and the Freedom Front Plus made some gains, but in the overall picture, they remain a minority now. It's easy, I guess, to lump the EFF and Freedom Front Plus on the same side as populists, but that's one specific term which people nowadays seem to throw around a lot, populism, and they don't unpack. To me, the EFF can be characterized as socialist, and the Freedom Front, in both their manifesto and in public, when they talk, they're very much in favor of limited government and individual freedom. Now, these two things are very starkly opposed. Populism and socialism on the one side increases government control, and then individual freedom advocates for less government control. So I think it's lazy thinking to lump the EFF and the Freedom Front Plus on the same side, but there you go. He mentions a few other populists in passing, but I don't think those warrant any sort of serious discussion. Now, the biggest problem, I believe, is that he sees the ANC and the DA as part of sort of I guess you can call it a liberal centre now. It's difficult to keep these things clear in one's head because liberal nowadays has very different connotations from classical liberal that it used to have. Liberal nowadays means someone who's in favour of big government, increasing state expenditure, increasing state control over individual lives. Whereas classical liberal is sort of the position that advocates for limited government, free markets, free speech, rule of law, that sort of thing. So I think it's problematic to put the ANC and the DA in the liberal centre. The ANC has very much in the past advocated for increased government control. Take, for example, the SOEs as one big example. It believes that it should increase its spending, that it has a very active role to play in the economy, that it's responsibility to care for people, to look after them, to guide their lives in certain ways, and that's very much opposed to what I would consider a classical liberal position. The author further later on talks about neoliberal economics and the problem he sees for that in South Africa. Now, neoliberal economics, to unpack that, is the view that sort of the world is in now. It's predominantly capitalist. It's focused on the private sector and austerity measures and that sort of thing, and I very much am opposed to that. Most economies, if not all, around the world today are mixed economies. They have a mixture of socialism and capitalism, of free markets and state control. We can't consider, I don't think, any country in the world really to be capitalist, not as capitalist as we would like it to be in any case. But part of this sort of neoliberal, I guess, worry of the author is that he says neoliberal economics, quote, makes the rich richer and the poor poorer and leads to environmental catastrophe. With massive unemployment, terrible poverty, and the world's worst inequality, South Africa is urgently in need of progressive alternatives to neoliberal economics. End quote. Okay, so he's clearly very concerned with inequality. He thinks it's a great moral harm to society. And I think here it's very important to unpack this. Inequality in and of itself is neither moral nor immoral. It just happens when you give people freedom. People have different abilities, skills, they allocate their time differently, they trade differently with each other, they choose to do different things with their money to invest it in certain ways. Maybe some people have a high time preference or a low time preference, so some people want to buy things now and improve their quality of life. Other people are okay are better at delaying gratification and investing for the future, and maybe deciding to put money away to use in future years to focus on things like long-term investments. So inequality is going to happen when you have freedom, and you would hope, or you would assume, that most authors, including the one writing here, is a proponent of freedom. Inequality is a byproduct of freedom. The more freedom you have in a society, the more inequality you're going to see. So as I mentioned at the start of this sort of subtopic of inequality, it's neither moral nor immoral. It's simply going to happen. Inequality is immoral when it's enforced by the state through force or fraud, or, for example, if a company gains control of the state and uses the pull and the power of the state to impose its view of how things should be run. If, let's say, a company, through tenders or corruption, that kind of thing, assumes more and more control of state bodies and state institutions, then inequality becomes a problem, because it's not within people's power to rise up through sort of the economic ranks or classes, if you want to talk in Marxist terms. Inequality is always going to happen when you allow people to be free. The most important thing is that it is true economic freedom, and thereby people, even if you consider them in the lower or middle classes, they can still rise up. People's wealth is constantly moving, it's fluid. As I said, people make different decisions, so they're constantly moving between these classes. It's not as easy as thinking, okay, someone is born into the lower middle class, they'll never rise up. Of course, it's difficult for them, but the more freedom you allow them, the more there are opportunities for them to pursue their own goals, their own desires, their own wishes, and to trade with other people. That's one of the great things about modern economies that are strongly, or some of which are strongly capitalist at least, is the sort of, we see specialization in these economies, where I don't have to grow my own produce, for example. I can trade with other people, which frees up my time to do other things which I'm better suited to. If we all had to be sort of subsistence farmers, we would all still be mired in extreme poverty, as people were in the Middle Ages, and as people unfortunately nowadays are still in many African countries and underdeveloped countries in the world, where there's always been less freedom. That's when you see less specialization, less trade, and those people are poorer. That sort of inequality is very difficult to get out of, and that's a real problem, and that's why we advocate for free markets, the rule of law, things like that, the easing of regulations, the easing of trade, of people's ability to do trade. That's, for example, why it's so concerning when politicians around the world advocate for increased trade tariffs and trade barriers. It's going to make it more difficult for people to trade with each other, to increase their own wealth. It's always better when there are more people doing things in an economy. It's a very complex system, and you see more growth the more trade there is. Now, just back to the matter of inequality and environmental catastrophe, I don't see the two as linked at all. The more free and the more capitalist countries are, the more those people care about their environment, the more time they have to focus on these sorts of social and environmental matters. When you're mired in very harsh poverty, you have to live day by day, and you have to just focus on surviving. You can't be worried about these big sort of concerns, such as environmental impact of your life. When you have more income to spend, you'll spend it on healthier choices. People are able to advance technology faster, for example, renewable energy or green cars, that sort of idea. Then you can spend on these sorts of things. When you're just trying to live, provide for your family, you're going to use whatever energy resources are available. I think that's why we should very much oppose any developed nations imposing their standards of clean expectations on the rest of the world. The rest of the world needs as much electricity and energy as possible, whether that comes from fossil fuels such as coal or gas, or any of the sort of traditional hated upon sources. Those should be allowed as much as possible, and then later on people can focus on the green sources. So one last point from the article, the author, now that the country has unfortunately in his eyes focused too much on neoliberal economics, he brings up the point that we need a socialist or social democratic alternative. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the ANC has very much increased. The South African government has very much increased in size since 1994. During apartheid, it was very big. It controlled a lot of people's lives. It spent a lot. To say that apartheid was socialist, a lot of people assume that apartheid wasn't socialism. It very much was. It placed the group over the individual, placed state control at the center, and tried to enforce that state's view on other people. Now, the new South African government is also very much focused on its big role in the economy. It spends more and more. The public sector wage bill is massive. The SOEs are massive. The government tries to come up with new projects and things to push the economy in the direction it thinks it needs to go. For example, through expropriation without compensation, or the national health insurance, and even the national minimum wage. These are all ways of the government trying to control different sectors. Now, these are all socialism, so the author is incorrect when he says we need a socialist alternative. Very much, I think the majority of South Africans endorsed and voted for, all those who were eligible and those who voted, they endorsed the social option, the socialist option. They voted for increased state spending, increased state control, less individual freedom, less room for the individual to move, to live. This was evident in the elections. No particular party punted very strongly the idea of individual freedom, as an absolute. They all advocate a mixture of certain things. So I very much think that the author of this piece shouldn't worry too much that we need a left and a socialist alternative. It's very much in vogue. I would say most, if not, probably most voters, the majority of voters see the state as it should play an active role. Philosophically, they believe that the state should be empowered, that it should do certain things. They don't see that the state should be limited as much as possible. So I really think the author shouldn't be worried too much about the poor performance of parties such as the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party or the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, NUMSA. He says that they didn't do very well on the ballot, but he shouldn't worry too much, because the socialist option is very much in vogue in South Africa and perhaps growing around the world. We might talk about right-wing populism and that sort of thing rising around the world, but whether it's focused on a certain race group or a class group, any populism is very much socialist in nature. It's all focused on the group, on the state as the solution. It's a case of groups competing with each other to take control of the state, to use the state's power for their own benefit. I think it's incorrect to call something socialist democratic, because socialism is inherently not democratic. Whomever gets into power is going to eventually use that power for the benefit of himself or for his group, and democracy gets watered down in this way. So listeners, please leave your comments below. Let me know what you thought of the podcast. I very much like reading and analyzing these sorts of articles. They have political and philosophical elements, and I think it's always useful to spend some time trying to unpack these things. And as I said at the beginning, it's good to define one's terms, even if you disagree with other people. If you can at least spell out how you see, certain terms such as capitalism, socialism, etc., what you think of them, then you can debate with other people. You should sort of set out your stall in a way and make clear what your premises are and what sort of area you're coming from. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like and share it, and I'll talk to you guys again next week. Bye.